It all started on an unremarkable weekend morning. I was just a sophomore back then, navigating the humdrum of high school and weekend part-time work. Nothing really unusual in my life. Walpole was always a little on the quiet side, nestled deep between forested hills and shrouded in fog for most of the year. They say the fog keeps secrets, and sometimes I believe it. That was until my cousin Amy burst into my apartment one morning, cheeks tear-streaked, her whole body shivering. "Peter, I don't know who else to tell," she managed, struggling to breathe as she tried to explain. "Whoa, Amy, what happened?" I asked, guiding her to sit down on my worn-out couch. "You look like you've seen a ghost." And honestly, she had, or at least something close to it. After a solid 10 minutes of coaxing, she finally opened up, recounting her night of terror. Amy had always been fascinated by the unknown. "It's why I moved to Walpole in the first place," she often told me. Apparently, she'd been reading up on paranormal folklore and decided she wanted a thrill. So, she set up her old camcorder in front of her bed, hoping to capture something strange or spooky in the dead of night. It was all in good fun, she insisted, clutching a pillow as she spoke, her eyes darting around as if expecting the walls to answer. She told me she had set the camera up and drifted off, and by morning, she was eagerly watching the footage. "The first few minutes, it was just me tossing and turning," she said, pausing before continuing, as if steeling herself to describe the disturbing part. "But then I saw it, Peter." "Okay," I said, a bit skeptical but curious. "What was it? Like a ghost or something?" She nodded, still visibly shaken. "It was me, but it wasn't really me." In the footage, as Amy had told it, there came a point when she turned her head slowly, too slowly to be natural. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, pupils so dilated that only the barest edge of her irises showed. It was like I was staring at the camera, like I knew it was there. And I grinned, Peter. I looked predatory. "Predatory?" I repeated, hoping she'd laugh it off and admit it was just a joke. She didn't. "Yeah," she replied, her voice trembling. Like I was sizing something up, hungry, but the weirdest part? My hair. It looked like something was holding it. Something just out of view. I stared at her, taking in the gravity of her expression. "So, then what?" Her hands were shaking as she continued. "The screen glitched, just for a second, and when it cleared, my face was twisted. Like someone had stretched it into an impossible grand-looking nightmare." She looked away then, adding in a whisper, and then it stopped. Later that day, Amy called me again, panicked. She found that all the images on her laptop had transformed, displaying the same disturbing face from the footage. Her music collection had turned to eerie static and rhythmic thumping, almost like a heartbeat. Walpole, being known for strange occurrences, was one thing, but this was different. "Peter," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I think I woke something up. I wasn't buying it at first. Maybe someone hacked her laptop." "Amy," I told her, though even saying it felt off. I agreed to go over and help clean up the files and try to restore her pictures. But when I arrived, something strange was in the air, an icy chill that wrapped around me the moment I stepped into her small apartment. I worked on her laptop, deleting corrupted files and reinstalling her music. We stayed up late, both of us too unnerved to sleep. "It's just a glitch," I assured her. But there was something in my voice that even I didn't believe. The year passed, and Amy seemed to have moved on, but she remained withdrawn, often avoiding cameras and never again mentioning her fascination with the paranormal. But one evening, she called, her voice trembling. "It's happening again, Peter. He's back. I don't know how, but he's back." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling my chest tighten. Amy explained that her boyfriend had thrown a birthday party and taken a group photo. In the picture, everyone's eyes had the usual red glare from the flash, except Amy. Her eyes were wide and dark, that same predatory look from the footage a year before. "Amy, listen. Maybe it's just—" "I know what it is, Peter," she interrupted, her voice eerily calm. "It's him. I can feel him watching." Months went by, and I convinced myself that Amy's fears were fading. Then one cold winter evening, I received a photo from an unknown email address. The image showed Amy's face, distorted with that horrible grin and pitch-black eyes, staring directly at me. It was then that I realized this was no ordinary glitch or prank. I felt my pulse quicken, and for the first time, the realization hit me. The cam freak wasn't just after her. It was here in Walpole, watching, waiting. I keep the lights on at night now. I avoid mirrors after dark, and I'll never, ever set up a camera in my room. If Amy's story taught me anything, it's that some things should remain unseen. The cam freak is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for anyone curious enough to try and capture him on film. And if you're thinking about recording yourself while you sleep, well, maybe you should think twice. After receiving that eerie photo, I didn't sleep well for days. My apartment felt different, as though the shadows were somehow denser watching me. I was cautious with every step I took, especially in the quiet hours of the night when the apartment settled and made strange sounds that now seemed like whispers. I tried calling Amy the next day. She picked up on the fourth ring. "Peter," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Did you get a photo too?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, same thing you saw in the footage, right?" She was silent for a moment, then spoke again, her words almost too soft to hear. "Peter, it's like he's in every shadow. I thought I saw him in my rearview mirror on the way to work. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. Amy, you need to get out of that apartment. Let's go somewhere safe, maybe Mom's place." I offered, trying to sound reassuring. But the truth was, I was scared too. I could feel it. The cam freak had found me as well. She agreed, but her voice was hollow, defeated. "I don't think leaving will help, Peter. I think it's attached to me, like a shadow I can't escape." Despite our attempts to return to normalcy, odd things continued to happen. One afternoon, I noticed that every mirror in my apartment was distorted, reflecting back shapes that didn't make sense. I stared into my bathroom mirror, and for a second, my reflection didn't mimic my movements. It grinned, a chilling, twisted smile that wasn't mine. I smashed that mirror, breathing heavily. As I looked down at the broken shards, I realized that Amy had gone through all of this, and worse, alone. At the same time, I tried to look into the origins of the cam freak. There were plenty of tales about Walpole, a lot of them just folklore to spook tourists. But one name kept coming up, the cam freak, tied to an old urban legend about a man who disappeared after spending days documenting the shadows in his home. They said he had been trying to capture proof of a spirit, a presence lurking in the shadows. The story went that he recorded his last words on a tape. "They're watching. They've always been watching." I convinced Amy to meet me at a small coffee shop just outside of town. She looked worn, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were haunted, darting toward every shadow. I ordered us 2 coffees, and we sat in a quiet corner, talking in hushed tones. "We can't keep living like this, Amy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She sipped her coffee, staring out the window. "What do you think we should do?" "I don't even know what he wants." I wasn't sure either, but then I remembered an old high school friend, Tommy, who was always into paranormal research. He had stacks of books on ghost sightings and spirits, and he even ran a blog where he documented supernatural experiences. "Tommy might know something," I said. "Is that all these books on folklore and the paranormal? Maybe he'll have an idea about how we can get rid of it." Amy nodded, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. But we were desperate, and that night, we met Tommy at his small office cluttered with shelves of dusty books and strange artifacts. Tommy listened to our story with wide eyes, occasionally scribbling notes. When we finished, he leaned back, tapping his pen thoughtfully. "I've heard the cam freak," he said, voice low, "but usually it's just whispers and rumors. They say he's a spirit attached to those who try to capture his essence on film or audio. That's why there are so few records of him, and those who do get his image, well, they don't last long." "What do you mean, don't last long?" I asked, my stomach turning. He shrugged. "They vanish one by one. No trafty, no expenastin. It's like he consumes them, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. Some say he thrives on fear, that he waits until his target is vulnerable. Amy's face drained of color. So, are you saying we're next? Tommy gave a summer nod. If you've seen him, it might already be too late, but there's a chance we could ward him off. He pulled an ancient-looking book from his shelf, flipping through its pages until he found a section on warding rituals. There's something we could try, he said slowly. A ritual to banish spirits tied to shadows. But you'll both have to do it in the place where you first saw him. That night, Amy and I gathered candles, salt, and sage, following Tommy's instructions carefully. We felt a mixture of dread and resolve as we prepared for what could either save us or anger the camp freak further. As we set up, the air grew sick, heavy with an unseen presence. Every corner seemed darker than it should have been, as if shadows were swallowing the light. The feeling of being watched was intense, but we pressed on, circling the apartment and placing candles in key spots. Finally, we began the ritual, chanting the words Tommy had given us. We could hear the wind picking up outside, howling around the building, and the shadows seemed to writhe, reaching toward us with dark, smoky tendrils. Halfway through the chant, Amy gasped, clutching her chest. "Peter, I feel him," she whispered. Her voice was tight with terror, her eyes wide and unfocused. I kept chanting, grabbing her hand to steady her. I could feel a strange chill spreading from her touch, as if the camp freak was seeping through her. The candles flickered, and for a brief second, a figure appeared in the darkness. A shadowed silhouette with hollow eyes and a stretched, sinister grin. It loomed over us, reaching out with long, bony fingers. "Leave US," I yelled, pouring every ounce of strength into the chant. Amy joined in, her voice trembling but determined. The figure let out a distorted, guttural sound, almost like laughter. It was close enough that I could see the details of its form. A dark veil that seemed to cling to it, obscuring its features, and yet, in its gaze, I could see endless malice. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to fade. The shadows peeled away, retreating into the corners of the room until only the light from our candles remained. Amy and I stood in silence, too shaken to speak, until the apartment returned to its usual stillness. In the following days, Amy and I felt lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted. She moved out of that apartment soon after, deciding to leave Walpole altogether. She wanted a fresh start somewhere far from the lingering shadows of her past. I never saw the camp freak again, but sometimes, late at night, I feel that prickle on the back of my neck, that familiar sense of being watched. And I know he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. For anyone who's curious, who thinks it's thrilling to chase after things that go bump in the night, I tell them to think twice. Some shadows are better left undisturbed, and some secrets should remain hidden. For a few nights after the ritual, I managed to sleep more soundly. Amy and I would exchange texts every evening, checking in on each other, and gradually, we both started feeling more at ease. But just when I thought we'd left the camp freak behind, little signs of his presence began creeping back into my life. One night, as I was closing up my apartment, I noticed that the shadows in my living room seemed denser, shifting in a way that felt unnatural. I brushed it off as paranoia, a leftover effect of that terrifying night. But then, as I settled in a bed, a chill ran down my spine. I could have sworn I saw a silhouette in the hallway, just a brief, fleeting shape, but it was enough to bring back all those fears. By morning, I convinced myself it was just a trick of my mind. After all, we performed the ritual, but something told me this wasn't over. One afternoon, Amy called me, her voice tense. "Peter, I had another nightmare," she whispered. He was there, waiting in the shadows." I tried to reassure her. "Amy, it was just a dream. We got rid of him, remember?" "No, Peter, you don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "In my dream, I was here, in my new apartment, and he was calling me back. He said he'd been waiting." The chill that ran down my spine was all too familiar. "What do you mean? He was calling you back?" She hesitated, her breathing ragged. He said, acting leaves, that it's his home, too, and that you can't leave either. Amy and I decided to meet again, this time with more determination to understand the cam freak. Our friend Tommy had mentioned the possibility of there being an object, something that might serve as a tether for the spirit, allowing him to linger in our lives. With this in mind, we went back to Tommy's office. Tommy listened to Amy's dream with a frown. Dreams can be potent symbols, especially when dealing with spirits like the cam freak. He could be trying to send a message. So, what do we do now? Amy asked, clutching her hands tightly. We performed the ritual. Why hasn't he gone? Tommy looked thoughtful. Maybe we missed something. He said you first saw him on the footage you filmed, right? We both nodded. Then there's a chance that the camera, or the footage itself, might be holding on to his presence, Tommy suggested. You need to destroy whatever you use to capture him. It might be the last connection keeping him in this world. Amy and I returned to her old apartment, dreading the thought of going back inside. The place looked vacant and abandoned, with no light coming from the windows. As we entered, memories of that night came flooding back, each shadow holding a hint of our past terror. We quickly found the camera, dust-covered and lying exactly where Amy had left it. It felt heavy in my hands, almost as though it resisted being touched. Do you think this is it? I asked, examining the lens, which seemed to glint in the dim light. Amy nodded, her face pale. It has to be. But what do we do now? Tommy said to destroy it. I replied, feeling a strange pang of reluctance. The camera was the last evidence of everything we'd gone through, but I knew we had no choice. Before destroying it, we decided to watch the footage one last time. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe we wanted to face our fears head on. We huddled around Amy's laptop, the camera connected, as the old footage began to play. At first, it was just like we remembered, grainy, dark, and filled with odd shapes and shadows. But then, as the video played, something new appeared. A whisper filled the audio, faint but growing louder. It wasn't English, it was a string of guttural sounds, almost like chanting. Amy and I exchanged a look, frozen in place. Peter, did you hear that? She whispered. I nodded, swallowing hard. Maybe it's some kind of warning? The whispering continued, building until the shadows on the screen seemed to move, pulsing in time with the sounds. Suddenly, a figure emerged, a dark, blurry silhouette. This time, though, he looked directly at the camera, as if he was staring through the screen at us. I fumbled with the controls, trying to pause the video, but the footage wouldn't stop. The figure's mouth twisted into that familiar, chilling grin. And then, with a flicker, the screen went black. We both jumped back, shaken. Amy immediately slammed the laptop shut, her face white with fear. Peter, he's still here, she gasped, watching us. I looked around, half expecting to see him emerge from the shadows. We had only one option left, to destroy the camera and the laptop with it. Without another word, we took them outside and smashed them against the concrete until both were in pieces. For a brief moment, everything was silent. I almost felt a sense of relief wash over me. But then, a chill swept through the air, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. Amy grabbed my arm, her grip tight. Peter, look! In the corner of the yard, a shadow appeared, no longer tied to the camera or the footage. It was him, the cam freak, free from his tether and more real than ever. He moved slowly, his twisted grin visible even from a distance. We didn't wait. We bolted, running through the streets, away from the darkness that seemed to follow us. Every time we glanced back, we caught glimpses of him in alleyways and doorways, watching, waiting, his gaze never leaving us. Peter, what if we can't escape? Amy cried, breathless, as we stopped to catch our breath. We will, I insisted, though sear gnawed in my heart. We just have to keep moving. We eventually found ourselves at Tommy's office once again, bursting through the door in a frenzy. Tommy looked up, alarmed by her panicked state. He's free, Tommy, Amy gasped. We destroyed the camera, but he's still here. Tommy's face turned grave. then there's only one thing left to try. You'll need to confront him directly, at the place where he was bound. Spirits like him can't fully roam unless their final connection is severed. You need to go back one last time. With heavy hearts, Amy and I returned to Walpole, to the very spot where she first encountered the cam freak. This was the source, the place where his spirit clung to life, and the only way to sever it for good. Tommy had given us a final chant, an incantation that would, if we were lucky, banish him permanently. We stood in the clearing, surrounded by the ancient trees, the air thick with silence. Amy began the chant, her voice steady but soft. I joined in, our voices weaving together as we repeated the words over and over. The air around us grew colder, and I could feel his presence, lurking, watching, waiting for us to falter. Suddenly, a whispering filled the clearing, growing louder, distorting our voices. The shadows around us shifted, coalescing into a familiar figure. The cam freak stood before us, his hollow eyes fixed on us with a malevolent intensity. "Peter," he rasped, his voice a hollow echo. "You cannot escape." Amy and I held hands, our voices unwavering as we continued the chant. The figure twisted and writhed, his shape shifting and stretching, his face contorting in anger. The shadows around him began to dissipate, breaking apart like mist. And then, with a final, anguished scream, the cam freak vanished, his form dissolving into the darkness. The clearing fell silent, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air felt light, free of his presence. In the weeks that followed, Amy and I began to rebuild our lives. The shadows no longer held that ominous weight, and we no longer felt his watchful gaze. Every so often, I glance into the darkness and feel a faint prickle of fear, but it was nothing more than a distant memory, a reminder of the horror we had faced and survived. And for anyone who's ever tempted to chase shadows, to seek out the mysteries lurking in the dark, I would offer a single warning. Some things are better left unknown,